All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Ian McLaughlin, and I'm a PhD in neuroscience from the University of Pennsylvania here in dreary Philadelphia. So today I wanted to talk about an article that was published in an outlet called The Conversation, about a topic that quite a few people, I suspect, have wondered at least one point in their lives. A topic that I'm sure is, regularly brought up in those sort of like galaxy brain conversations that happen in dorm rooms and at certain kinds of high school parties, I guess. When I see the color red, do you see the exact color red that I see? And by that I mean, when we look at this, beautiful red rose, right? I think we can all agree that this is indeed a red rose. But would I call the way you're perceiving this rose the exact same color? Or would I call the way you're experiencing this rose purple or blue? Or maybe more realistically, maybe you see this rose as, slightly darker or brighter than I do. Maybe our experience of this red rose is really quite similar, but not exactly identical. Maybe you see it's, cherry lipstick red instead of like fire truck red, while I couldn't possibly distinguish between the two. Well, this is the sort of topic that this article that was published in the Conversation explores. So there have been some pretty fun memes that sort of forced us to explore the contours of these, possible neurophysiological differences that distinguish us, maybe most infamously, the dress. And there are like zillions of explorations of that particular instance, and several explanations for why this might have happened, why some people see white and gold and some people see blue and black, despite the fact that it was indeed a blue and black rose. Or a blue and black dress. That would be cool. But so for what it's worth, when it comes to this dress, the best explanation, I think, is based on how it is that different people's brains process, the picture in the context of the presumed environment in which the picture was taken. Whether subconsciously people are perceiving the dress as being, taken under the light of something like the sun, right, natural light, or whether they're perceiving it under sort of like the cold light of fluorescent bulbs, right? And so I've linked a paper down below that explores that concept. But there's a reason this picture went so thoroughly viral. There's not a particularly satisfying way to prove that whether we do or do not experience a given color in the same way. What we do know is quite a bit about how it is that color influences our perception, right? So first of all, we certainly know that some people certainly do not perceive this rose in the same way that, a majority of us do, right? Some people who are colorblind, for example, absolutely do not see this rose with the same way, or perceive it in the same way that most of us likely do. Specifically, people with protanopia, people who essentially lack the capability to perceive the color red. Protanopia, though, is just one form of colorblindness. You can see the main ones described here. There are, basically there are plenty of variations on limitations that some people have regarding color vision relative to the sort of typical perception, right, which is some combination of red, green, and blue. Tritanopia, for example, which is a form of colorblindness that is rather rare, at least to be born with, due to the location of the gene for the specific photoreceptor that's sensitive to the color blue, on it being on a different chromosome than the red and green photoreceptors. The blue one is on chromosome 7 rather than the X chromosome, and it results from the absence of a different photoreceptor, right, than the red and green ones, the S cone, relative to the more standard forms of colorblindness. And so it's probably helpful, just as we're diving into this, to just review, really quickly what color generally means. Okay, so fundamentally we're talking about photons that are splashing up against our eyeballs, right, at specific wavelengths, which you can see up here. So, we're only sensitive to a certain, to sort of a sliver, certain wavelengths of light, basically from dark purple, or deep purple, I suppose, to dark red. Right, so the visible light spectrum is this teeny tiny little sliver of the electromagnetic spectrum. So gamma rays, X-rays, microwaves, radar, right, and so on. These are all different points along the electromagnetic spectrum. And the only reason we even know that these photons are around us is because we have photoreceptors that happen to be sensitive to radiation at those specific wavelengths, right? And so here is a picture to give you a sense of what we're talking about here when we're talking about photoreceptors, okay? And so, because radiation at those specific wavelengths happen to bounce off of physical objects in specific ways, we see objects in the ways that we do, right? And so, if photoreceptors were sensitive to X-rays or gamma rays, right, our perception of the world would be extremely different, right? Those forms of radiation can pass through objects in ways that, the spectrum to which we're sensitive can't. So visible light is able to bounce off, objects in our environment, giving us a sense of where in the environment they're coming from. So certain photons, bounce out at us, off of a plant, for example, like those plants. We see green off this sweater, grayish. Off that rose, right? Oops. Oh, right. And now we have the dress. Okay, there we go. And so, photons bouncing off of this rose, right, we're seeing red. And so in the case of that rose, those petals are basically like soaking in, every visible wavelength except for red, which then happens to bounce off of those petals and splash up against our retina, and then we see it as a red rose. Okay, so, there are a bunch of like fairly mind-blowing explorations of what color perception is like for people who have these unique forms of color blindness or color perception available on the internet, but I feel like I'd be pretty negligent if I didn't include at least some pictures of what the variations might be perceived as being in different forms of color blindness. And so they're just like modifying the color spectra in these pictures, right? But you can get a sense of like how different things can look. But I think it's pretty fair to assert that when most people wonder if we all see a rose or a tomato or whatever, which we all call red, they're not really thinking of people who have like overt differences in like the literal photoreceptors that enable us to experience those colors in the first place, right? I think most people, when they're asking this question, are more interested in, whether with, completely normal distribution of photoreceptors, that enable us to see red, green, and blue, most people are interested in whether we experience them in the same ways, right? And so for me, I think it's worth acknowledging that there's, clearly at least a bit of diversity regarding color perception, just based off the fact that some individuals are, essentially insensitive to green or red wavelengths of light. I'm no expert in the field of, the visual system, but I can imagine that, a substituted nucleotide here or there, substituted amino acid here or there in the proteins might result in a photoreceptor that responds just slightly, ever so slightly different or differently to the same wavelengths of light. And so, I hope you'll forgive me for not going into the super basic biology of color perception here, but, photoreceptors are proteins, right? Just like, neurotransmitter receptors are. And so if you alter an amino acid here or there in a neurotransmitter receptor, there's evidence that it can be associated with things like an increased predisposition to, various forms of addiction. Have a substitution in a dopamine receptor or a mu-opioid receptor. There's at least some evidence, or a nicotinic acetylcholine receptor, there's some evidence that can dramatically influence one's predisposition to addiction. And so, if it's possible that there's at least a bit of diversity in the relationship of a neurotransmitter receptor, again, dopamine receptors, mu-opioid receptors, and so on, due, of course, to the accumulation of mutations over generations that don't necessarily interfere with, or didn't necessarily interfere with, our ancestors' ability to reproduce, why wouldn't that kind of diversity be reflected in similar types of proteins that interact with photons rather than molecules? So, in other words, like, even if somebody rejects the notion that there's, a genetic explanation for predispositions to addiction, which, fair enough, there's plenty of evidence, but, there are some, serious people who disagree with that assertion in good faith. But I don't think that they disagree that there's genetic variation in the sequences that encode neurotransmitter receptors, right? It's just the sequences. You can't really argue with that. It's in the code, right? And so, you have an A where I have a C in, my gene for my dopamine receptor. So, I think it's reasonable to suggest that some minor alterations in the code for photoreceptors might result in very very subtle differences in how people perceive the same wavelengths of light, even at that most basic of levels, right? Literally how photoreceptors are responding to photons. But it could absolutely be the case that, there are genes that are, these genes that compose our, the sort of basic level of visual perception are highly conserved, right? That there's almost no variation in the sequences for photoreceptors. Generally speaking, genes that are absolutely, critical to the survival of an organism experience very, very little change. So like the genes that are basically like the same in all of us, no matter who your parents or your background is, they tend to be pretty important to your survival because, of course, if one of them had a mutation in an ancestor, it would have been more difficult for them to reproduce. If it would have been more difficult to pass on, generationally, if it compromised our ancestors' ability to reproduce, right? So let's just assume, unless somebody has inherited, a form of colorblindness, of course, we all have functionally identical photoreceptors, right? Same exact sequences, or even if the sequences are slightly different, functionally, they're not consequential, right? They do the same exact things. So let's assume that all of our photoreceptors respond to precisely the same wavelengths in precisely the same ways. They're excited to the same degree, and so on. There's still, even that, which I don't think is true, but even if we stipulate that, there's still an opportunity for us to perceive colors differently. And that's what, these authors were exploring, what they were focusing on. So they focus on the sort of higher order components of color perception. Beyond just like photoreceptors. They note that when we, look at a scene, a picture or maybe a video, and we're asked to describe that scene, we tend to focus on specific components of that scene or of that video. We tend to focus on warm colors, oranges, yellows, reds, rather than blues and greens. And that kind of makes evolutionary sense if you think about it. So imagine, being one of our ancestral primates navigating its environment. There's plenty of green everywhere, right? Trees and weeds and stuff like that, right? Stuff that we can't digest, right? Leaves. And so, berries, fruit, animals, delicious, right? So they might, they highlight a study that showed that when people were shown images of a bunch of people all standing, near a table that was filled with like watermelon and strawberries and things like that, they were basically, and the images were basically like saturated with the color yellow. People would still be able to recognize the types of fruit, but they'd no longer be appetizing to the people who were looking at it. You no longer wanted to eat that strawberry or that watermelon because it was yellow. And so similarly, people would still be able to recognize people's faces, right? People looking at the images or at the videos that were saturated with yellow, they'd still be able to recognize people's faces, but they tended to look strange and unwell, right? Maybe sick. And there's some great examples of how advertising and movies can manipulate our evolutionary predispositions to associate certain colors with certain reactions. And so Adam Ragusa on this platform has a great video on how coloring can overtly influence how appetizing we perceive foods to be. And I was going to get into that. Like I monkeyed around with some pictures of raw steak. But the point is, if you manipulate, this sort of general color scheme of any given picture, it can dramatically influence how appetizing it is, these sort of visceral reactions. And so as the authors, both of whom are at the National Institutes of Health, by the way, as they note, color perception seems to be critical to how we perceive things. Right? Rather than just like purely basic perceptions, rather than just like, that's a strawberry because it's red and it's shaped like a strawberry. It's deeper than that. It's more than just recognizing, things as being red, green, or blue. It's certain colors tend to be associated with certain, visceral reactions. Again, something being appetizing or something being attractive, or somebody being attractive. So, the reason these guys wrote this article is because they've done their own experiments. Using a technique that's called magnetoencephalography, or MEG. That's really what we call it. And so, they've used it to basically classify specific patterns of brain activity that were associated with being exposed to specific colors. So they highlight that they come up against a specific difficulty, right? One of, I'm sure, many, but this one, it was a principal difficulty. It's extremely difficult to standardize everybody's unique neuroanatomy using a technique like this, right? So, we all have brain wrinkles, right? But our brain wrinkles aren't all necessarily in the same exact places relative to one another. And that's just the most visible level of anatomical variability, right? Just like, there's room for us to have some differences, again, when it comes to how our neurotransmitter receptors bind our neurotransmitters. Again, dopamine, mu-opioid receptors binding endorphins or more, importantly for my research, morphine or heroin. So there are even more microscopic differences that are extremely difficult for us to measure in this moment, just given currently available technology. Right? We're pretty good at sort of broad changes in activity in the brain, but we're pretty terrible when it comes to trying to image in real time activity in the brain of somebody at the sort of circuit level, or particularly at the molecular level. And so, it's really difficult to control for or standardize any kind of variability, anatomical variability, molecular variability that we know with 99.99999 degree certainty. We can never be 100% certain, but basically certain that there's, that level of genetic variation, and they could be, functionally consequential. Certainly when it comes to how we interact with drugs, but probably or perhaps when it comes to interacting with certain wavelengths of light. But what they found, this study using MEG, what they found was, generally speaking, observing changes in patterns of brain activity in people who were exposed to different colors, different patterns, things like that. What they found was that the same colors did tend to elicit similar patterns of brain activity, right? So, like, in other words, seeing the color red, elicited similar patterns of brain activity between different individuals, okay? So there's a sort of standard-ish reaction that we all likely have to the same colors. So where does that leave us? We can't know for sure that when you look at this rose, and that you're experiencing red in precisely the same way that I am. It seems like we're certainly experiencing something similar, right? Given the results that they found, right, in their MEG study, at least similar, right? So we're gonna to answer this, age-old question. We're gonna have to wait until somebody brilliant invents, a new imaging platform that enables us to peer a bit more deeply into the brain to know for sure. But until then, I think we're just gonna have to assume that there, probably are some subtle differences between how this rose, this red and green rose, technically hits your mind compared to mine. And of course there's a whole conversation about, the differences in memories and emotions, and even, other subtle sensory experiences that we may have when we see this picture of this rose. You might remember the smell of a rose. That might come to mind. Maybe the first time you ever gave or received a rose, maybe on a day like today. Or, maybe the first time you ever walked into a florist, right? That humid, earthy smell, that wet, sort of humid, earthy smell. Or maybe you have terrible memories associated with this particular flower, right? That's a whole separate topic for another day. But that's pretty much what I have for you. But there's one more thing that has always been interesting to me and sort of baffles, I think, a lot of students that dive into neuroscience or take introductory biology when they're studying the eye. So keen observers of that picture of our photoreceptors might have noticed something kind of strange about how our photoreceptors are organized, right? So you can see that sort of a zoomed in little area of rods and cones. This is obviously a very, very simplified cartoon of what, the photoreceptors look like in our eye. But, if you look at them, right, you can see that this sliver is towards the back of the eye, right? And you can see that those rods and cones are pointing backwards, right? Instead of pointing outwardly towards the direction from which all the photons that you're seeing are coming, pointing outside of our head, they're pointed at our head. So that means the photons have to pass through the entire retina, neurons and cells and gooey stuff, and then ultimately bounce up against our cones and rods, right? Our photoreceptors. And so it turns out that rather than just being a sort of quirk of evolution, which is actually how it was taught to me, that and I think it's how a lot of evolutionary biologists have described it for a very, very long time. I believe Richard Dawkins was befuddled by this organization, and it totally makes sense why what kind of selective pressures would have resulted in this, right? And basically, and by the way, it's essentially all vertebrates have this sort of like intuitively ridiculous organization, but it turns out that it may actually help us to filter the diet that our photoreceptors, of photons receive, right? So reds and greens are better capable of getting through all that biological stuff, particularly the glial cells in our eyes, more effectively than blue light. So, we get a kind of filtered view of the ratios of how much reds and greens and blues, in the light that surrounds us, right? And so the glial cells that are there, and they're not depicting the glial cells in this picture, but they're just, imagine them sort of everywhere. They're sort of, all over the place. And what they seem to do is they seem to act like, sort of like fiber optics, that can guide light, physically guide light. And what these glial cells seem to be doing is guiding red and green light to our fairly insensitive cone cells, and then blue light, which is, which doesn't pass through all the biological material and importantly glial cells nearly as effectively. It ends up being scattered as a result quite a bit more, thereby hitting our rods more so than, red and green light does. And so the effect that this has is that during the day, when there's tons of light all around us from the sun, of course, right, our color vision is substantially enhanced, rather than having everything washed out by blue. But thanks to the effects of those glial cells in, our eyes at night, our night vision isn't too severely disturbed, right? So it's a pretty cool evolutionary filter that actually seems to enhance our capability to manipulate or interact with and be affected by photons coming from the sun. Pretty cool. So it may not be completely wacky. It may not just be this weird quirk of evolution that, just was good enough that it didn't get selected out. Rather, it might have been an advantageous mutation, a series of mutations. So yeah, can chocolate be red? I can't imagine why it couldn't be, right? All right. Yes, thank you, Cosmic Rose. I appreciate that so much. All right. Why don't we see if we can start the live half? Oh, and I can remove the this and that. Great. Hello, everybody. My name is Ian McLaughlin, and I have a PhD in neuroscience from the University of Pennsylvania. And just now on the YouTubes, I talked about this age-old question that I think college students across the world, high school students across the world have wondered. When you see the color red, how can we be sure that you're perceiving it, you're experiencing it in exactly the same way that I am? Or when you see the color red, would I call that purple or blue or, something totally radically different? So I just talked about that on youtube.com/anthropoid. There's a link to it in my profile page on this platform here on Periscope. And let me know what you think. And the reason I got into this topic is because there was an article that was published in an outlet called The Conversation by some scientists at the National Institutes of Health that explored the topic. Whoops. Okay. Do you have a Clubhouse? I actually am on Clubhouse. I haven't used it yet, though. So yeah, I should probably get my act together a little bit and explore it. It seems like a really interesting platform. Okay, what is the relationship between neuroscience and the expression of genes? Oh man, there's a massive relationship. And it's one of the most active areas of neuroscience research. My research sort of touched on that topic. Oh, Javier is calling it. So more on neurogenetics, you might call it, or behavioral genetics is another term for that field, after we have our conversation with our friend Javier in London. Javier, what's on your mind?
Hi. Interesting topic.
Yes, I thought you'd like that.
Yeah. How are you?
I'm not bad. I'm hanging in there. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good, thanks. I'm actually reading a document on this today, on perception, actually. The primary secondary quality distinction. Where is the color? I imagine you would take a position that the color is, just something the brain puts on the representation, right?
It's a byproduct of neurophysiological activity, yeah.
So the object itself has no color. It's
we only perceive a certain interaction that it has with a certain wavelength, certain component of the electromagnetic spectrum. So it has a color because an object, let's say, whatever, the plant, you can't really see the plants behind me, but one of these plants, those plants, the reason we see them as green is that they're absorbing basically everything but green, and then therefore reflecting green back at us. So you could define that as being its color, right? Just because when it comes to that part of the electromagnetic spectrum, only that little sliver of the spectrum is reflected back at us. So you could call that an inherent property of the object. But the only reason we experience that is because we have photoreceptors that are sensitive to those wavelengths, right? If we were instead sensitive to X-rays, right, we wouldn't see it have a color probably. It would just be sort of this weird, I mean, X-rays would pass through it, right? So we would see this like strange kind of ghost of a plant. So yeah, I mean, but you can make that argument that because of the fact that certain objects reflect certain colors back, that's an inherent property of the object. But the only reason we're aware of it is because of our neurophysiology.
Yeah. So, if is it possible for a person to be so colorblind that they don't see, like, how far can colorblindness go? So that, like, how far can it go?
Yeah, I mean, there's a fairly rare form. Well, let's just say it's not the most common. Let's see, I think I can bring it up on, where is it? Yeah, well, oh, shoot. Here we go. Okay. Yeah, I mean, so there is something, monochromat, achromatopsia. So that is like, yeah, it's black and white, basically. Totally colorblind is what it would be called, but it's only one of like quite a few different types of colorblindness and not the most common. So that basically the reason for that is because the genes that encode the cones that enable us to see, red, green, and blue. Red and green are both on the X chromosome, right? Which you inherit as a male. You inherited yours from your mother, of course. But the gene for what's called the S cone, the cone that enables us to see blue, is actually on chromosome 7. And so you would have to have a deficiency in both of those collections of genes to be a monochromat or to be completely colorblind. So that's why it's less common. But yeah, I mean that definitely exists.
So my understanding is that white and black and that neither of them are called colors. Is that true?
I mean, I don't think neuroscientists really have a dog in that fight. I mean, it's maybe a physicist would have a stronger opinion about that. I mean, it makes sense to me. I mean, because color is the byproduct of how the visible light spectrum interacts with objects in our environment. White would just be an object is reflecting everything back at you. Black is that it's absorbing everything, right? It's reflecting nothing back at you. If you want to call that, it's a semantic definition, right? I mean, you could say that if there's no selection for a specific wavelength, then therefore it has no color. That's fine. I wouldn't argue with that.
Right. So why is it that for a person who has total color blindness, as you said, he only sees black and white, what is going on in it, like explained scientifically for him sometimes to see black and sometimes to see white?
Okay, yeah, sure. So we have different types of photoreceptors, some cones that are sensitive to certain wavelengths of light, red, green, and blue. But then we also have rods, right? So rods are essentially just sensitive to the presence of light. Is there light? Is there not light? And they have different sort of like benefits, different advantages evolutionarily. But what's going on for somebody who's has achromatopsia or is a completely colorblind, monochromat? Basically, it's just, is this object absorbing all of the photons that are hitting it, or is it reflecting some of any photons? And if it's reflecting, if it's not particularly bright, let's say, if it's not reflecting very many photons, it's probably going to be closer to black. But if it's reflecting a ton of photons, then it's probably going to be white.
Do these totally colorblind people, do they see gray?
Yeah, I mean, so it'll just be that, different shades of gray, right, from black to white. And so, that gradient would be determined, or the point at which any object is on that spectrum would be determined by, like, how many photons are being, are hitting that object and then bouncing off of it and splashing up against their retina. And then, depending on, it's really just the volume of how many photons are hitting it. If it's a ton of photons, then it's probably going to be whiter. If it's somewhat fewer photons, then it'll be grayer. And then if it's like no photons, it'll just be black.
Yeah, that makes sense. You mentioned earlier that the mind or the brain is like giving us these additional things like red, the perception of this red. Would you call that qualia, or would you say it's not?
Well, I mean, it is what I think people would call qualia, yes.
Yeah. I really want to know, like, what is your doubt about the existence of qualia? Who would you refer to? Whose argument?
So I can't remember if Patricia Churchland specifically attacked qualia, the concept. I know she's argued with Searle quite a bit, pretty vehemently. They're pretty fun interactions they've had years ago. But I said, if I remember correctly, she did. She basically, argued that because, fundamental to the argument of qualia is that, so just so everybody here isn't like, what are they talking about? Qualia is a term that is used to refer to the proposed, what it's like to experience the color red, right? I show you a color rose, I show you a red rose. You see it's a red rose. You can classify it as a red rose. You can detect that it's red up top. You can detect the green stem, but you also have a whole host of, other reactions to seeing that red rose. There's something that it's like to look at a red rose, right? And so, there's a whole school in neurophilosophy that would call that qualia. And then the fundamental argument that they make, though, is that there is that experience of what it's like to look at a red rose there is no neurophysiological substrate for it, right? That is some component that is above and beyond just brain activity. And so that is where I have, some bones with that argument, because that, we could right now sit and explain pretty much any aspect that you would bring up, like, you have this emotional reaction. Well, we know where those are encoded. You have these memories of maybe the first time you gave someone or received a rose. We can explain that. I can't pinpoint every single neuron in your brain that's doing it, but we know that they're there. We know that they're doing, without them, you wouldn't have those memories. And so that's really my argument. I don't argue. For me, qualia refers to the broader set of cognitive, perceptual, sensory, memory, all of those components that are influenced by sensory experiences. That's what qualia is really referring to, and it's just a poverty of understanding that broad set of activity. That's my argument against qualia.
Even if you're an emergent materialist, isn't there still a big gap, a huge distinction between knowing how something works and the experience of its working?
Well, I mean, that brings us to, Frank Jackson's Mary's Room. I mean, I think that there isn't actually. And even Frank Jackson now agrees, right? He decided that Mary's Room, which he came up with, just so everybody's on the same page here, Mary's Room is a thought experiment, neurophilosophy or philosophy of mind, where you can imagine a Nobel laureate, scientist named Mary, neuroscientist named Mary. She's just the top, best possible. She knows every single neuron involved in experiencing the color red, okay? But her entire life, from birth, from soup to nuts, right, she's lived in a room of purely black and white and gray, right? So zero color at all. And then one day, but she knows everything that there is to know about color vision. One day somebody comes in and shows her, the color red, shows her a painting with all kinds of reds and, a Rothko painting or something like that. And for the first time in her life, she actually sees the color red. And then the fundamental question is, does Mary learn something new that day? She knew everything about color vision, right? That's what we stipulated in the beginning, but she never experienced it. Does she learn something new from the experience? And initially that was, considered to be a pretty strong argument, but, ever since then, it's been pretty. Anybody who has spent a substantial amount of time or a meaningful amount of time studying neuroscience would know that, to say that you know everything about color vision means is to say that she would understand that after seeing the color red, beyond just the visual cortical activity, beyond the photoreceptors, beyond all that stuff, beyond just the pure physics, she would understand that the limbic system would be activated because this is a novel experience, right? She would have probably a burst of dopamine. She didn't expect this to happen. She's lived for probably something like 60 years. She has a Nobel Prize. Never, having been exposed to color vision, but she has the facilities for it, faculties for it. So she would have limbic system activity. It'd be novel. It'd be surprising. It'd probably be very beautiful. She has memories of all the times that she, studied. She pined after wanting to see a red rose for the first time. She would understand all that. To say that she understands everything about that experience means to say that she knew that all that would happen. The difference is that it would be the first time a lot of those neurons would have been activated. So that's what Mary's room argues. And so no, the difference in experience something versus understanding something is just different patterns of neurons that are activated by the novelty of that experience, right? It's not that there's some disembodied, feature of that experience that is, unexplainable.
I see what you're saying. It sounds, I've come across some terms, reductive physicalism. I think
Yep.
I think that may come under that. I think Mary doesn't learn something new from the angle of functional knowledge, right? So of how the neurons function and all of that. But I think there's a different kind of knowledge that is added, but not of a functional nature. So I think the nature of knowledge gained is different.
I agree. I mean, that it's a different experience. She's never had that experience. So new neurons are being activated that weren't activated before, but she could have, again, we're saying she knows everything that there is to know about, experiencing color vision, experiencing the color red. She would anticipate that. But then that would be the first time she experienced it. So, if you want to call that learning, that's fine. I agree with you there. But that does not, imply that there is no neurophysiological explanation for that experience.
Oh, okay. So we both agree, like, for example, if someone fully understands everything that goes on in the human brain, in the state of what, people would call having a crush or falling in love, that is very separate from the experience of that, of how it feels to...
I mean, I don't know. Yeah. I don't know what you mean by very separate, but I mean, it is, these are distinct constellation of neurons. Yeah.
Okay, but even the neurons, so the neurons associated with understanding, they still don't provide the experience themselves.
Yes, that's correct. I mean, sure, but I don't think that supports any kind of claim that, once again, understanding or qualia do not arise, or understanding or experience does not arise from neurons, just like the neurons that enable us to remember a fact, right? Just because they're different neurons doesn't mean that they're fundamentally distinct phenomena, right? They're essentially the same phenomena. It just so happens that when Mary sees red for the first time, when somebody gives her a rose on Valentine's Day for the first time, and she can actually see the red rose, she is experiencing a whole constellation of other activity simultaneous to seeing the red rose for the first time. And so, yeah, different constellations of neurons, but that does, at least for me, and I've never seen a strong argument, does not suggest that, just because these are different constellations of neurons, that translates to there being, it doesn't justify the arguments that qualia make.
Right. Yeah. I've heard someone describe this bridging this gap between what is physically going on in the brain and then this emergence of qualia, or the emergence of experience. It's kind of like rubbing the side of a lamp 500 times and watching a genie just pop out. It's just you're crossing just ontology here, from one ontological domain into a totally different one. So on the one hand, physical things are happening. On the other hand, there's an experience of maybe of things.
But you're basically repeating yourself now, man. Like, what I'm telling you is that we could sit down, with a whiteboard or whatever, and we could talk about all the various systems that are being recruited when Mary sees that red rose for the first time, right? Limbic system, basal ganglia, hippocampal regions, all of these, we could even probably plot out a lot of the changes in neurotransmitter concentrations that occur for that first time. So, one can make an argument based on, just philosophy that they are different, but I am making an argument based on like actual experimental science. And so, I understand the argument you're making that these are distinct experiences, right? Knowledge is distinct from experience, but I don't care. There's no biological basis. There's no argument for that, and there's no argument for that beyond just saying it's intuitive that they're different. And for me, I can actually point to neurons and say, like, these neurons are activated when she sees red for the first time. These are neurons that were activated, that have nothing to do with sensory experience, but are influenced by sensory experience, right? So, I guess it just depends on whether or not you are predisposed to finding those types of, those data convincing. I'll
just leave with one last question, more on the science. When it comes to seeing red, I have a question about where in the brain, what parts are activated, and also, is it like a single neuron which is responsible for the final, perception of red, or is it like different regions, or one region but lots of neurons?
Okay, yeah. So the way it's never going to be just like one neuron. That's just like not how the brain works. It's always going to be a cluster of neurons. And of course, red is like, you can just decide that one specific wavelength on the electromagnetic spectrum is red. Everything else is something else. I can't remember what the spectrum would be. Let's just say it's like, what is it? It's probably something like maybe 600 something nanometers. So let's just say, I'm probably wrong, but let's just say 620 nanometers, that is what we qualify as red. Anything else is not red. 621, not red. 619, not red. But they're going to look very, very, very almost indistinguishably red, right? We just don't have that level of specificity. Some people do, but in any case, so, just keeping that in mind. What happens is we have certain types of photoreceptors called cones, certain types of cones that are preferentially stimulated by a certain stretch of the electromagnetic spectrum, from like reddish to very, very dark red, right? And so once a photon of that wavelength bounces up against those photoreceptors, whatever, some interesting biology happens, and then that stimulates neurons that then stimulate other neurons that then send signals through this long projection to the visual cortex, right, the occipital lobe. And so the way the occipital lobe is organized, or the way, let's just say, the visual cortex is organized, is in what are called layers. And basically the way it works is that different layers have different levels of complexity that they decipher. So let's again focus on a red rose for no particular reason today, of course, but let's just say what's happening is that you're getting stimulated by the red petals, right? Those photoreceptors are being stimulated, and then eventually those signals arrive at the visual cortex, and then certain layers of neurons, certain collections of neurons will respond because those photoreceptors, those red photoreceptors, let's call them, are being stimulated, and only those neurons would be receiving that much activity from those photoreceptors. They're not going to be as stimulated by cones that are sensitive to green or sensitive to blue. Okay, and so it's not just one neuron, but it is one sort of collection of neurons that, yes, would be stimulated by red. And then it goes up in complexity. Like, not only is this red, it's not a red crayon, or it's not a red wall or chair. It is a red rose, right? You begin to classify, categorize what you're seeing. And so you might start with, this is not exactly how it would work, but it would be like, it has curved edges. It has a straight line stem. It has a sort of a cluster, a rose-like pattern. It has like an organization that sort of spirals, right, with petals. And then you would say like, oh, it's in the shape of a rose, but you would distinguish it from a tulip, for example, red tulip. I don't know if tulips can be red, but in any case, and so then you would sort of go up and up and up in complexity, in categorizing complexity. And so it's not just one neuron that's devoted to a red rose neuron. It is neurons collaborating with one another, like neurons that are stimulated by red, neurons that are stimulated by curds, neurons that are stimulated by plants, and so on. And then ultimately that, this is a red rose, happens, right? Because all of those neurons collaborated together to be stimulated by the shape of those photons coming at you.
Sorry, I did remember. I've heard someone tell me that language involves our perception of a color. Is that true? Like, if we don't maybe have this language for certain words, I don't know. I don't remember what he was getting at, but I just thought maybe you could elucidate on that.
Yeah, I mean, so that's a huge topic, and I don't have as strong opinions on that. It really emerges from linguistics, which is sort of like an older field. But yeah, I mean, I recall arguments about, there are certain tribes or something that didn't have a word for the color blue or something like that. And so, the argument would be that they therefore can't like blue doesn't make sense to them. Like they can't categorize blue. For me, that doesn't make any sense. Like, that there's the biology's there. However, when it comes to like, linguistics, relationship between language and cognition, let's say, there are some really interesting relationships. Like there's this one example. I believe these are tribes in the Amazon. Man, I'm forgetting what their names are though. Shoot. Anyways, there's these two tribes and different languages. Okay, one tribe has, and they identify numbers in different ways. One tribe has a word for one, they have a word for two, and then they have a word for more than two. The other tribe has, a word for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then more than 5. And so, this is anthropological research, so it's not like somebody sat them down in an fMRI or something like that. But it did seem to be the case that for the tribe that only had words for 1, 2, and then more than 2 had some serious difficulty managing the concept of like 12 or 50, right? Just that it just didn't come up, right? And so, there is an argument for some relationship between, I think, and again, not as strong of an opinion here, but there is some, I think, compelling arguments to be made that because of the way that language develops, because of how early language develops, and, because essentially we narrate our thoughts in certain languages, that there is a kind of like a top-down sort of effect on cognition as a result. There are languages that, I could refer to certain like familial relationships, like that is my mother's cousin, right? Or like my mother's cousin, or that is my wife's uncle, right? These types of like kinship designators, right? Whereas in other languages, like there is no way, there is no like kinship bucketing, right? So it's just like, this is just a totally different person if they're not within your nuclear family. Again, I'm sort of treading into deep water here, and I haven't really reviewed this in a very, very long time. But all of this to say, I do think that there is an argument to be made. But when it comes to like sensory perception, that tribe, let's just pretend that tribe does exist, that doesn't have a word for the color blue. That tribe has blue cones, right? They experience the color blue. And I think it's just a byproduct of the fact that blue isn't a particularly important color for us, actually. It's everywhere, right? And we can't interact with it very much. And I think that's really what it reflects, rather than like literally because they didn't come up with a word for blue, they don't experience the color blue. That doesn't make any sense to me.
So you kind of hold that the language is a little bit irrelevant to the experience of, they may just lack the words, but they do see the colors the same way that we do.
For basic sensory perception, yeah. But again, I definitely leave room for, but more higher order cognitive processes, computation, things like that. I do leave room for some pretty substantial effects of language on how those operate.
Do you think that maybe with more language, for example, we have more names for like different shades of blue? So we have like maybe 15 words for certain shades of blue. In having our language that advanced, would you say that someone who's, for example, only has the word blue to designate that range,
as opposed to like sky blue, baby blue, powder blue?
Yeah.
Right.
Would you say that he doesn't have the same perceptions as the person who has the more language?
No. I mean, you might. I think you can make an argument that arming somebody with pre-designated categories of different colors might enable them to more effectively distinguish between different shades of blue, but that has no bearing on their capabilities to distinguish those shades, right? They just happen to call it all blue because never in their lives did they have to distinguish between powder blue and baby blue, right? But I think you can, in other words, you can make I wouldn't be surprised if if you were to test somebody who has, let's say, 50 words for different shades of blue, that they would more effectively respond with like baby blue, sky blue, powder blue, rather than like lighter blue, lighter than that blue, lighter than lighter blue, like that's how it would go, I think. But anyways, Javier, awesome conversation as always. I really appreciate you calling in, and hope to talk to you again soon.
Thanks a lot, Ian. Take care.
You too. Javier, always bringing the fire. Please grab your Twitch username. I actually am on Twitch. It's like Anthropoid Psi, but I'm very negligent in using it. Thank you for bringing that up, though. So this is on YouTube, youtube.com/anthropoid. While not perfect, some photographers practice using orange-colored glasses to block the blue, and it helps them see things in a more monochromatic and helps their black and white pre-visualization. That's interesting. There is some really interesting stuff that like performance enhancing glasses for like golf, for example, or for various sports, and basically what they're blue blockers. And I have blue blockers. I used to wear them in college because of course I did. It's a very strange perceptual experience because like we are bathed in blue. And as I talked about on YouTube, if you look at our photoreceptors, bringing them up now, they're organized in such a way, and there's an argument here, that they basically are organized to compensate for just how much blue there is around us at all times, right? And so, and it can sort of get in the way of the perception of other colors. And so literally, like, one can make an argument that the photoreceptors in our eyes are sort of arranged as a kind of filter to do something similar. But of course, we're still experiencing blue, and it would be terrible if we couldn't. Evolutionarily terrible. So that's interesting. Afternoon. Happy Valentine's Day to you and your family. Why, thank you very much, Amanda. Happy Valentine's Day to you, and happy Valentine's Day to you, Eternal Flame. Question: where do I find the desperate single women today? I don't know. Today, gosh, that must be really tough to be dating. Yeah, I have some single friends that are both male and female that are it's been rough this past year for them. They're about my age, right? And when you're out of school, when you're out of even grad school, there's just fewer and fewer venues to meet people. And COVID-19 obviously has like made it extraordinarily difficult for even the least optimal venues like bars and stuff. Verboten. That's rough. So reach out to any of your friends that are maybe feeling a little bit lonely today. Valentine's Day is a terrible, terrible holiday. How bad does cortisol affect the body? If you're constantly on fight or flight, how bad is long-term damage? Dub, that is an awesome question. So cortisol, for anybody that's not familiar, is what's called a glucocorticoid. So it is like the stress hormone. So fundamentally, and I've never really talked about this, fundamentally, why do we call it a glucocorticoid? Hey, Haley. Why do we call it a glucocorticoid? Right? It's cortisol. Why not just call it a corticoid? Well, the reason is that what cortisol is doing is basically siphoning off glucose, right? Just getting more glucose into the bloodstream, taking it away from, a variety of, the liver in particular, but a variety of different structures, right? That can be very, very helpful if you're in a fight or flight situation, if you're literally trying to run away from like a bear or like a lion or something, right? Who cares if your nutritional activities or your digestion, your all those processes aren't working properly, because if you don't mobilize as much glucose as you possibly can into your bloodstream as quickly as possible, you might not be able to run as fast. You might not be able to run for as long or climb a tree as fast or whatever, right? So that's like the fundamental evolutionary explanation for why it is we even have a cortisol response. Okay. But cortisol does a lot more than that, okay? So cortisol, similarly to that effect on glucose, right, which again, short term, very useful. Long term, very bad, right? Similarly, glucocorticoids are anti-inflammatory. They're immunosuppressive, cortisol in particular, right? And you actually probably know this. If you've ever gotten a rash or any kind of like, skin situation, a doctor may have prescribed you hydrocortisone cream. And that is basically cortisol. And what that does is, like, let's say, I have a rash right here, and it's an allergic reaction or something like that, contact dermatitis or something like that. And it's just a pain in the butt. And it's like unpleasant, it's painful, it's itchy. And it's not like if I don't have this, I'm going to die, right? It's just this irritating byproduct of my skin being hyperreactive, allergically reactive. You just wipe some of that cortisol cream and then it's basically gone, right? And depending upon how the concentration of that cortisol, that hydrocortisone, it'll be stronger or weaker. But anyways, so, you know this intuitively if you've ever been exposed to that. But it doesn't just affect, inflammatory processes of the skin. It also affects your immune system writ large, just in general. It suppresses immune system responses. And so, and if you've been to college or you've been to high school and you noticed that around finals, exams time or midterms time, people tend to seem to have a bit more cold sores. What's the deal with that? And I knew, having, led a recitation of like 26 or 28 college kids in intro neuro, it was like so overtly demonstrated to me. It was like, 30%, 40% of the class had cold sores. Cold sores, as you all probably know, are basically herpes. It's a byproduct of the herpes virus, herpes simplex virus. Herpes virus, you all almost certainly have it. Most people have it. It's largely a harmless virus, except for when your immune system is not on top of its game. And so what happens is that herpes virus actually lays latent, dormant in your sensory ganglia, in neurons that are like up here in your head. And then generally speaking, your immune system, if ever one of those little viral particles pops out, your immune system grabs it, kills it, prevents them from being able to spread to your skin, and then infect those cells and then rupture them, and then you begin shedding viral particles, which is how, and then you kiss somebody or whatever, or you wipe your mouth, you touch something, you touch somebody's face or something like that, blah, 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 you spread the virus. That's how it spreads. When the immune system is suppressed because these students are stressed out, right, chronically, or let's say consistently stressed out for longer than just a day, for like a week, 2 weeks, that's why that happens. Those viral particles, the guards are off duty. Right, your glucocorticoids are suppressing that immune system reaction, and so you get herpes, or herpes, whatever they're called, lesions, herpetic lesions, whatever. So you got your immune system, you have your metabolism. It also cortisol, altering the way glucose is handled by our body isn't the only way that cortisol influences metabolism. It also changes the way that we absorb nutrients from just our diet. It changes how motile, right? Literally, like the muscular movements of our digestive system that are critical to being able to sort of wring out as many nutrients as we can. It influences, so you have, let's say, nutrition or digestion, you have metabolism, you have the immune system. There are a variety of other ones. It'll inhibit muscle growth, right? And so, there are a bunch of really wild studies. Or not a bunch, but there's some classic studies of, what is it called? Like, it's called like stress-induced dwarfism, I believe, where, there are cases of young children who, or not that young, who are so like below, if you have a younger sibling, or maybe you remember when you were a kid, you go to the doctor's office, they measure your height, they measure your weight, and then they have this like weird looking chart, and they sort of plot where your the course of your development. Are you about average? Are you above average? Are you lower than average? And there are these cases of kids who were severely traumatized. We're talking like being chained to a radiator, like that kind of stuff in the basement, right? That like it's not just like your mom is a little bit tense, right? It's like real severe trauma. That and these kids, you measure, they appear to be, the growth is suppressed, and you measure their growth hormone, circulating growth hormone, and it's basically zero. And then all of a sudden, once that kid is removed from that stressful environment, all of a sudden, their growth hormone spikes, returns to what would be called normal. Their growth comes back towards average, normal, and it was all just because of all that severe stress, right? So there's endocrine effects, right? I mean, cortisol itself is, of course, a hormone, but it can influence other hormones. The last one I'll cover is in the brain. So cortisol influences the brain. We have glucocorticoid receptors in the brain. I've actually studied them in my brain region of choice, the interpeduncular nucleus. But basically, cortisol influences, everything from neurogenesis in certain parts of the brain, the very few parts of the brain where neurogenesis in the adult brain occurs. We're talking like the dentate gyrus of the hippocampus, important neurogenesis, the generation of new neurons. But it also influences, synaptogenesis, like how many synapses are forming, how many synapses are being cleaved away, right? So it influences some of the most basic, because again, frame it all as this is an organism that is being threatened by a predator or by a tribe of other, Homo sapiens or other primates that are coming to attack them and, and do terrible things, right? And so who cares if you're not forming synapses? Who cares if you're not digesting? Who cares if your metabolism is all screwed up? You need to survive like this moment right now. And so the problem, however, is that when it's sustained, when you have chronic stress, there's a mechanism in our brain that basically detects for when those spikes of cortisol occur. Right? You have this spike of cortisol. This little detector, little sensor, detects that, and then eventually begins getting activated, and then will begin to suppress the release of cortisol, so you don't endure this kind of chronic stress state, right? And so you have this rise of cortisol, and then you have this rise of activity in this part of the brain, and they suppress each other, right? Negative feedback loop is what that's called. However, if for whatever reason that source of stress does not abate, right, in your environment, whatever caused that initial spike of cortisol, if it doesn't go away, or perhaps more importantly for modern life, if you don't perceive it to have gone away, whether it's stressful or not objectively, that mechanism can deteriorate, and you become less capable of suppressing the release of that cortisol, and therefore doesn't matter if you're even perceiving stress anymore, you're experiencing stress biologically, and then you're off to the races with all those negative consequences for health. So does cortisol affect the body? It does very much. It's the kind of thing where if you don't have enough, it can be deadly, right? You can essentially have like what looks like a diabetic coma, right? Where you just have, or if you have way too much of it, it can basically exacerbate essentially any underlying malady, diabetes, cancer, a variety of different conditions. It itself doesn't kill you, but it pretty much renders everything else more fatal. All right, that's my spiel on cortisol. If my feet are numb and itch, am I diabetic? That is one possible explanation for why somebody might be going numb. Afternoon, leggy lady. My pleasure, Dub. Yeah, great topic. Thanks for bringing it up. So yes, that is one possible explanation. There's a bunch of possible explanations, like certain deficits in like vitamin B12, for example, and fly eagles fly. That's right. Thank you. Another is like, vitamin B12 deficits are associated with tinglingness, pins and needles, numbness. Interestingly, that is a side effect of the overuse of a drug called nitrous oxide, laughing gas. Generally speaking, whippets, that's another thing that, another name for it, but it's laughing gas, basically. It's what they give you in the dentist's office. And it's great. It's a very useful gas, right? But it's a really interesting molecule because it's not like binding receptors, right? It's a tiny little molecule, right? But it's able to very rapidly diffuse through neurons and blah blah blah. Anyways, it goes all through the body, and for people who instead of just like doing whippets and then goofing around and then going to sleep, right? Some people get like tanks of nitrous oxide and they just they're on it for hours and hours and hours, and it can influence their vitamin and mineral absorption. And that is one of the telltale signs of nitrous oxide abuse is tingling in the limbs. Fortunately, it abates or it is it's remedied by just not doing nitrous anymore and supplementing with some vitamin B12. But there's a severe alcohol consumption can be associated with that kind of a syndrome as well. Alcohol consumption, we're talking a lot. Is well known to influence vitamin and mineral absorption, and in the same kind of way as I was talking about nitrous, has that same effect. So yeah. Lack of negative feedback. Yeah, nice one, man. I've never laughed at whippets. Greyhounds are funnier. Very nice. Trying modafinil to stay awake. Had Adderall for ADHD, depression, but side effects bother me. Thoughts? Just to stay awake. Modafinil is a really interesting drug. For anybody that's not familiar, that's the non-brand name of Provigil. It's an interesting drug. Has some interesting pharmacology. So ADHD, so you said Adderall. Yeah, Adderall is dextroamphetamine. It's a form of amphetamine. They all have interesting pharmacologies. Don't get me wrong, but Adderall, amphetamine, much like methylphenidate or Ritalin, the lion's share of their pharmacological activity is in doing two things. First, binding dopamine receptors. Second, making dopamine neurons churn out more dopamine. Really interesting pharmacological mechanisms. They don't have the same mechanism, modafinil or Ritalin, Adderall, or amphetamine. But they both essentially accomplish the same thing, which is cranking up the volume of dopaminergic transmission, catecholinergic transmission, not just dopamine, norepinephrine, but mostly dopamine. Modafinil was marketed as a non-addictive alternative to those what are called maybe classic psychomotor stimulants, again, like amphetamine. That it wasn't habit forming, that, in other words, it wasn't addictive. Adderall and amphetamine is obviously well known to be addictive. People use it recreationally, of course. And so that's how it was initially marketed. And I believe some of the earliest trials were for military applications, were for, pilots who would do 18-hour sorties, right? And have to be in a plane for literally 18 hours. One of my friends, actually, is in the Air Force. He flew... he currently flies F-16s, I believe, but in the past he flew whatever the new version of the U-2 is. Those surveillance planes that go 70,000 feet in the some crazy altitude, and those sorties or whatever would go on for hours and hours, be up there for an entire day, right? So that's why the Air Force has always been interested. Yeah, I'm taking questions. Sorry, I'll wrap this one up. Anyway, so that was the initial marketing for modafinil. It was subsequently, and the reason for that is that they thought that they had identified modafinil has unique pharmacology relative to Adderall or amphetamine. It turns out that modafinil does influence a lot of the same neurotransmitter systems that Adderall does or amphetamine does. It does influence catecholamines. It does influence dopamine, but it has a bunch of other pharmacology as well that renders it different. It has different molecule. So it'll just depend on it's been explored for, I believe there have been trials for it as a treatment for ADHD that were not exactly compelling. But everybody's different, and I totally understand that the side effects of amphetamine would be unpleasant. Just the difficulty falling asleep alone must be pretty rough. But there's a bunch of other ones, right? It can be very stressful. It can interfere with your libido or your ability to quench your libido, if you get my meaning. It has a bunch of side effects, and so that's totally understandable. And yeah, give it a shot. If your doctor's willing to work with you on that, and if it doesn't work, you can always go back and maybe adjust your dose. Some people have really strange reactions to modafinil in that they become very socially anxious. I recall reading that. No idea why that would be the case. I mean, that's true for amphetamine too. People become sort of paranoid and kind of aggressive and anxious. So your mileage may vary. So yeah, give it a shot. I'd be interested to know how it works for you. Okay. Yeah, sorry I went on so long. Is there anything new for nerve and neuropathy pain? Really suffering but don't want an addictive medication. Yeah, Philip. I'm trying to remember. The short answer is no. The short answer is chronic pain, whether it's derived from neuropathy or something else, chronic inflammation of some sort. It's one of the most difficult aspects of our biology to treat. We really don't have good solutions. We have some tools. Fortunately, we're not back in the pioneer days where it was just basically whiskey or nothing. Or I guess in the pioneer days it would have been something like beer or cider. But maybe let's say the the cowboy days, whatever you call that, the wild, wild west, where it was all just like whiskey. At least we have opioids for like severe pain, but you're right that they are not particularly effective for chronic pain, and obviously very easy to form a substance dependence, if not an addiction. Yeah, pregabalin, gabapentin are usually the two most used, I think. Yeah, so I mean, yeah, those aren't new, but you're absolutely right. They're frequently used in concert with or in combination with an opioid, or just alone. Those are interesting molecules. They're very different from opioids, but there have been studies that show, and it's very important to get these doses right and to not go overboard with either of them together. But pregabalin, gabapentin. I think that's like Neurontin, I believe. Neurontin, whatever. These are GABAergic drugs. These are drugs that influence GABAergic signaling rather than opioid signaling, mu opioid signaling. So, but yeah, that has been around for now several years. But definitely worth checking out. Yeah, they put me on cocodamol with amitriptyline for sciatica. I see. Yeah. So yeah, I'm struggling to remember. There was some interesting development in pain research, but I'm struggling to remember. It's certainly not the kind of thing that would be on your shelf. That would be like that your physician could prescribe yet. Okay, can you keep your answers short? I'm working on it. Sorry about that, Luffy. What do you think about psilocybin and its effect on brain neuroplasticity? I'm just going to go with Popo. Psilocybin is something that I've talked about quite a bit now on YouTube, youtube.com/anthropoid. And in particular, its role in possible role in the treatment of depression and PTSD. Some pretty compelling evidence at this point that psilocybin, which for anybody that's not familiar, is the sort of active ingredient of magic mushrooms. It is essentially an analog of dimethyltryptamine, DMT. It's 4-phosphoryl-DMT, dimethyltryptamine. And there's some pretty compelling evidence at this point that it's been effective for the treatment of depression. That's rude. No, that's okay, Leggy Lady. I get it. Not everybody's interested in these topics, and I could be more concise and parsimonious. So when it comes to neuroplasticity, there's some interesting research suggesting that it does have some influence on neuroplasticity, on things like synaptogenesis. And when it comes to why, I don't think that underlies its purported or putative therapeutic mechanism. But I think it's an interesting one. And that is a topic that I've talked about, specifically its effects on neuroplasticity on YouTube, youtube.com/anthropoid. So you can check that out. Just search for psilocybin and you'll find several videos. I find it to be very interesting. NoFap, is it good for men? So that was the question that you had, Luffy. Is NoFap good for men? Fundamentally, so for anybody that's not familiar with what NoFap means, NoFap means the complete abstinence from masturbation. Okay, and so therefore, let's say a reduced frequency of orgasm and ejaculation. So first of all, right, NoFap, like for any male who does not do it themselves consciously, it's going to happen to them at night when they're sleeping. So, it's otherwise called a wet dream, right? That just happens automatically. And there's a lot of evolutionary reasons for why that would be the case. Essentially keeping the pipes in order, keeping the biology in order. And so, I suspect it doesn't have nearly as strong an effect as people suspect it does. There's a lot of BS artists out there, making all kinds of crazy claims. Like, I did 6 months of NoFap and like my muscles got bigger and, I became smarter, more charming. And I became, fundamentally, I think what it's emerging from is a complete misunderstanding of biology in general, male biology in particular. There's evidence like that if you abstain or you fail to ejaculate, right, on a somewhat regular basis, that can actually suppress your testosterone levels. And of course, all these folks tend to be just obsessed with testosterone. Testosterone is probably one of the most overrated hormones. Cortisol is a far more important hormone than testosterone is. Testosterone is important, right? Of course, particularly to male biology. It's also important in female biology. Females also make testosterone, but it's just not the end all be all. I think a lot of this arises from guys who, certainly a lot of them were in the sort of bodybuilder community, the weightlifting community, and that's a community that I used to pay attention to, and pre-MD almost every day to twice daily to post-MD 290-day streak. Post-MD, I'm not sure what you mean. After you got an MD, but anyways, like I've never seen any claims apart from just anecdotal. And hey, dude, you do you. Like, oh, microdosing. Oh, interesting. Okay, let me come back to that. If you feel more confident, if you feel like it's improving your quality of life, go with God. Like Godspeed. Do that then if it improves your quality of life, right? There's no reason, but to claim that it has some kind of beneficial effects on biology, and it's almost always male biology, of course. It's just I've never seen any that have any biological basis in reality, and so but hey, so that's my take on it. I mean, for example, if you were to try to have kids, right? And I suspect you're probably a bit younger than me, just because typically it seems that people who are interested in this just tend to be younger. In that time in life when like everything is just terrible, that like maybe mid to late adolescence where it's just everything is just awful. But let's say you were trying to have a kid and you're struggling, you were unsuccessful, and you went to a fertility, consultant or something like that, a physician, and they asked you, how frequently are you ejaculating? And you say never, right? Never, except for, the handful of times when, we try and have a kid, they'd say, increase the frequency, keep it going, so yeah, it's just, there's just not a lot of basis in biology. That's all. But hey, if it works for you, go for it. It's not going to have a particularly severe consequence for you. So, yeah. Okay, so pre-microdosing almost every day to twice. Oh wait, I definitely struggle with that. Microdosing has been a godsend. Almost every day to twice daily to post-microdosing 290-day streak. But what is that? Oh, you're talking about a no-fap as well. Not necessarily. It's more of a clear perspective on the present. That's great. Yes, I still come on here for the time being. But I am also on YouTube, youtube.com/anthropoid. And I'm on this new live streaming platform called HAPS, HAPPS.TV. Links to both in my profile. Porn addiction causes all kinds of issues with dehumanizing. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Desensitizing, escalating. Yeah, extremes. No question in my mind. That's true. Yeah. Okay. Let's see. Oh, how does porn and hyper dopamine feedback loops affect the brain? Yeah, I mean, so that is a pretty controversial topic, actually. The effects of pornography on, the brain. So first, there are just the bare basics, right? You are right to highlight dopamine. There are studies that have shown that the patterns of activity that occur when, people are watching porn that they would find appealing, there is a sort of reward response, or it's really the expectation of reward response. There is a dopaminergic reaction. And I think people make a little bit too much out of any kind of similarities to addictive drugs, but, there is a similarity there. So yeah, but for me, I think the issues that Leggy Lady brought up are the more important ones, are just like, how it influences your relationship with, other people, doesn't mean, but the flip side is that when people try and argue that it's the worst thing, it's a scourge, and that it's terrible, it damages humans, it damages the brain, that's also an exaggeration, right? There's no evidence that pornography actually damages the brain, right? We are talking purely psychological here, and so yeah. But it's an important topic. What makes benzodiazepines so addictive? Rebel Dog Duke. That's a great topic. So benzodiazepines, for anybody that's not familiar, is alprazolam or Xanax, Valium, diazepam, Klonopin or clonazepam. There's a bunch, right? Ativan. These are substances that bind the GABA receptor, right? Or Ativan, lorazepam, I should say. That's the kind of benzodiazepine Ativan is. But what's interesting about benzodiazepines is that they bind the GABA receptor. GABA is the nervous system's neurotransmitter. It's its principal inhibitory off neurotransmitter. It suppresses the ability of neurons to fire action potentials, fire impulses. But what's interesting about benzos is that they don't bind where GABA binds the receptor, right? Receptors have what's called a binding pocket. Neurotransmitter gets lodged in there and then stimulates or has some effect on that neurotransmitter receptor. Maybe it makes a neuron fire an impulse. Maybe it inhibits impulse firing or action potential firing. Benzodiazepines bind the receptor at a different site called the benzodiazepine binding site. And what benzodiazepines do is they render the GABA receptor more sensitive to GABA. When the actual neurotransmitter GABA binds its receptor and a benzodiazepine is bound to the receptor responds even more than it normally would. So why can it be addictive? So first, benzodiazepines for everybody, somebody can form a substance dependence, right? And so that's like the first order concern. And that any human can develop a substance dependence to benzodiazepines. The reason being that GABA, again, the principal off signal, is being affected, right, by the chronic presence of any benzodiazepine. And just like is the case with essentially every other drug, that psychoactive drug, when somebody takes those drugs consistently, chronically, the brain will undergo adaptations. The brain is always changing. And if there's this chronic presence or this chronic state of affairs where the GABA, let's say volume, if you could imagine, if you could just imagine the landscape of your brain being a combination of a bunch of different volumes of sounds, right? What's going to happen is that when you are, imagine that you have a chord, right? You have, different notes, right? You have dopamine, you have serotonin, you have glutamate, and you have GABA, right? Let's just imagine that. Those levels of those neurotransmitters is constantly fluctuating, right? Every moment, when you're asleep, when you're awake, doesn't matter. But then when you take a drug, right, a drug that influences just one of these neurotransmitters, it's sort of like you have two of these notes, right? And so, my thumb now is the benzodiazepine, let's say. And so what the brain is going to do is it's always going to adapt to reapproach what we call homeostasis, the baseline, what the brain looked like before you ever took a drug in the first place. Okay, and so what it's going to do is, since this is chronically here, right, it's chronically elevated, the benzodiazepine is always there. But the brain can't control that, right? It can't directly influence that, right? Because other parts of your brain are determining that you're going to continue taking this substance. But what it can do is turn down its own GABAergic volume, right? So it can reduce the number of GABA receptors that are around in the brain. It can change the way those GABA receptors respond to GABA. It can reduce the number of synapses that a GABAergic neuron has, right? So it turns down the volume so that now this is, the combination of the benzo and its own GABA, your GABA, is basically equivalent to what it would have been in the beginning. But then what happens is that you stop taking the benzodiazepine, right? But the GABA volume is still suppressed, right? Because the brain has become used to the chronic presence of that benzodiazepine, and now what you have is insufficient GABA, right? And it's going to take, just like it takes time for one to form a substance dependence on a given drug, it takes at least as much time to recover from that substance dependence, to, recover the original number of GABA receptors that a person had, to recover the sensitivity of those receptors to GABA itself, right? That takes time. That's what we call acute withdrawal. That's when people are, for any drug, this is true for opioids, it's true for cannabis, it's true for alcohol, certainly true for benzodiazepines, that period during which the brain is recovering to what those GABAergic signals were like before somebody took benzodiazepines is extraordinarily unpleasant as a result, right? Potentially life-threatening. With insufficient GABA, you can have seizures and potentially die. So benzodiazepine withdrawal is no joke. Why it could become addictive, though? GABAergic drugs, or let's say, benzodiazepines aren't like alcohol. Alcohol, it does influence GABAergic activity, perhaps the most important of its activity, but it also cranks up dopamine levels, right? does a bunch of different things. Binds mu opioid receptors, influences serotonergic signaling, and pretty much every neurotransmitter. But importantly, it's cranking up those sort of like pseudohedonic kind of neurotransmitters. Benzodiazepines don't do that. Benzodiazepines essentially just bind GABA receptors. But for people, particularly for people who are prone to anxiety, just reducing reducing the signaling throughout the entire brain can be extremely relieving. And that sense of relief can be extremely addictive, right? There is a minor reward associated response to GABA, to a benzodiazepine, but it's nothing like alcohol, right? But just the relief of that anxiety is that what we call anxiolysis can be really, really addictive. Good morning, mate. Good morning, brother. If you're taking sertraline, is it dangerous to mix with cocaine? Well, yes. I mean, so yes, but for a variety of reasons. Most importantly, it's because, sertraline, for anybody that's not familiar, that's Zoloft. It's an antidepressant, an SSRI, but it also influences a bunch of other neurotransmitters, interestingly enough. It's not just serotonergic. It influences, I believe it influences dopamine reuptake, actually. But it also influences like the adrenergic system, the norepinephrine signaling system. But most importantly for this question is that it is prescribed for depression, for obsessive compulsive disorder, for panic disorders, for social anxiety, for all of these types of psychiatric conditions, all of which cocaine exacerbate. All of them. Cocaine is almost like a pharmacological way to just induce bipolar mania, right? You get like extremely high, an extreme high, the massive dump of dopamine and some serotonin as well, and that's extremely enjoyable, pleasurable. But almost just as fast as it comes, it goes, right? And you have this severe fall into depression, lethargy, anhedonia, and it's just this roller coaster of a drug. Usually people either snort it or smoke it by turning it into its freebase form as crack cocaine, and that is just an absolute roller coaster. And so, of all of the drugs that you could do, of course, you shouldn't do any of these drugs if you're being treated for depression or whatever psychiatric condition. You shouldn't do it. I very rarely advise somebody either way to do a drug, because I don't think it's my business. But if I were in your shoes and I was being treated for depression, I would just stay away from that because it's just going to make things so much worse for you. And it's just going to be extremely unpleasant. Cocaine is like, I think, one of the most torturous drugs out there. So of all the drugs you could do, that would probably be the one to stay away from. Or one of the ones to stay away from. Okay. Did you get the vaccine? Not yet. I cannot wait. One of my good friends actually did today get her vaccine. Quite a Valentine's Day gift. And she got the Pfizer one, but my parents got their first shot. I think they must have gotten it, their second shot. I think they were getting on the 11th, so they must have gotten it. Yeah, I cannot wait. I imagine I'm going to cry when I get it. I imagine I'm going to tear up. His hairline joins the cast 30 minutes after he started the cast. Yeah, that's right. I am a testosterone generating male. I'm one of the, I think, 60% of men who will probably lose my hair. It's unfortunate, but hey, we play with the cards we're dealt. My dad still has like all of his hair. He's up there. He's not a spring chicken anymore, and I still think he's not completely white. Like his hair is not completely gray or white. It's crazy. His hair genes are like wild, and it seems like I probably didn't inherit his hair, unfortunately. Okay. I am not black. Can I join? I don't know what you mean by that. Can you join what? I agree with you, but what do we do if we know someone who is in this? What's the advice? Which country is higher than USA? I'm not sure what you mean by that. I agree with you, but what do we do if we know someone who is in this for vaccine volunteers? Which country is higher than you? So the USA, the United States vaccine rollout now is doing a fair bit better than it used to be. It was just laughably just a series of embarrassing, bumbling failures. but now, you know, we're sort of, it's going okay. You know, it's not as bad as it used to be. It is one of, I think in the United States, in terms of like percentage of population, I think we're second to Israel. You know, there's obviously a lot of like issues with, you know, how Israel's rolling out their vaccination program, but they were very, very, obviously it's a much smaller population as well. Yeah, I think the UAE has been doing pretty good. I think something like maybe Qatar or maybe Bahrain is doing well. You know, UK is doing okay. Europe has not been doing as has not been as rapid as I think a lot of people anticipated. But the U.S. is now, I think, second only to Israel. Now, that's not saying a lot, right? It should be way better than this. I think that there was just a complete failure of imagination in terms of like how to get these vaccines out to as many people as possible, as rapidly as possible. People became so concerned with like, we have to make sure only the people that deserve it get it. You know, from my perspective, and I think a lot of epidemiologists and public health people agree, like, just vaccinate everybody. Just who cares? Just get as many people vaccinated as soon as possible. I don't care if they're a billionaire. I don't care if they, you know, can work from home. I don't care, right? Just get people vaccinated. And you know, I think it's just like this neurotic like need to make sure that, you know, everything goes according to the plan. But you know, but all of that said, now things are going a bit better. I think we're beyond what was the initial goal of daily vaccinations, which is excellent. And then of course we're, you know, soon going to see more vaccines come on to the field, right? And they will be easier to transport. The J&J vaccine is going to be much easier to transport than the mRNA-based vaccines, the Moderna or the Pfizer one. There are other ones. Novavax has a vaccine. There's even a vaccine company that's been working on an oral vaccine. The results are not particularly compelling, but hey, that's pretty cool. I swear I took it in the second dose, and I swear I didn't feel anything. It's easy. Oh, that's fabulous. Yeah, you know, that there has been a pretty interesting diversity of reactions. My parents, my mom had, you know, I think what they're calling the COVID shoulder, where, you know, just her shoulder became quite sore. Very, very common. I think that's the most common reaction. And I'll let you know. And my friend who got vaccinated today, we talk like on a daily basis. So I'll be sure to give you an update on how she's doing. She's about my age. But, you know, and some people, of course, do have rather severe reactions like, you know, headaches, fever, but, you know, nothing, they're not nearly as, these are not bad reactions. I mean, they're unpleasant, but they're not like really scary reactions. If anything, you know, those more unpleasant reactions are just a sign that the immune system is responding, that you're generating antibodies. That's great. Okay. So people have to learn so much more than they did in the past. What can we expect? Yeah, in the human brain 100,000 years from now. I love it. Unknown. Yeah, that's a great topic. So, you know, there's a bunch of interesting dynamics when it comes to human intelligence over the years. There's the Fisher effect, for example, or the Flynn effect, where, you know, if we're just using IQ tests to measure intelligence, a lot of problems with using IQ tests. Not a perfect encapsulation or measurement or metric of human intelligence, but it is one way to quantify certain aspects of human intelligence, and it's at least standardized, right? And IQs have steadily been rising. No real idea, no real explanation for why that is. A lot of different potential explanations, but humans are getting more intelligent just by that metric. Are you a doc? I'm a PhD, so I'm technically a doctor, yes, but not a physician. I'm a scientist. Even better than a physician. Yeah. So, and you know what? This just reminded me. I don't know why, but there's this really amazing case study of a deaf population in Nicaragua, I believe. A deaf population in Nicaragua, who years ago they had no way to educate these deaf children, right? They had no sign language. And so what do they do? But they had schools and everything. They just didn't have a way to communicate, right? So what do? So this deaf population, they begin generating a sign language, a form of a sign language. Generally speaking, it was younger people who developed this sign language, right? It started out very rudimentary, they grow up, they teach other, deaf, new deaf young people their sign language. And, as those people get older, they're basically stuck with that initial form of their sign language that they created. Then the younger generation begins to iterate and complexify and make, that sign language, let's call it Nicaraguan Sign Language, more and more complicated, more and more comprehensive and thorough, and a richer language. And it gets to the point where that, let's say, youth version of the sign language is essentially unintelligible to the older sign language speakers, the earliest, population of deaf people who in Nicaragua who develop this sign language. And what we know is that, generally speaking, it is young people who tend to create new languages, and who tend to drive changes in languages. And, there's just something that happens as we get older where, for whatever reason, that sort of iterative, generative process of manipulating, influencing, changing language, evolving language, just does not compute in the brain of an adult, but it does in the brain of a child. So, that I only bring that up. I'm only reminded of that by your topic, because, I think that it's probably impossible for somebody like me in my early 30s to even imagine, to even remember what it was like to have those reflexes, to come up with secret languages. I don't know if you did that. I totally did that with my friends. But I couldn't imagine even trying to do that now. I wouldn't even want to, and so I think it's very difficult for us to even imagine what it's like to have a brain like that. Watching my daughter picking up words at this insane, she's about 2 years old, at this insane clip. I mean, her vocabulary just doubles every day. It's crazy. She's not speaking in sentences, or at least trying to speak in sentences, not particularly interesting sentences, but she's asking me what my favorite color is, what my favorite food is, asking me if she can do certain things, asking me, pointing things out like, oh, that's a bridge, can we go over the bridge? It's so wild, just overnight. And so anyways, when you say 100,000 years from now, I think it's just going to be all of that process, that human evolutionary process. But then also, obviously, by that point, if we're still around, of course, humans haven't been around for all that long, right? We've only been around for a couple 100,000 years, right? And so, modern humans, let's say, and I think modern Homo sapiens, let's say, there's some arguments that the modern human brain hasn't been along for that long, that, there have been some changes. Actually, on haps.tv, link in my profile page on Periscope, I talked about a study that came out that basically showed at least one gene that diverged when humans, Homo sapiens, and Neanderthals and another type of primate, anthropoid, called Denisovan, when they split. One specific gene seems to influence a lot about how the brain developed. So you can check that out, haps.tv. Link in my bio. But anyways, the integration of technology is just going to be such a huge game changer. And, I think that'll change that'll be a operative within maybe 10 years, not that long. At least a rudimentary level. 100 years, man, I mean, it's probably going to be pretty substantially sophisticated. 1,000 years, I mean, now we're talking I think we have a poverty of imagination when it comes to imagining, trying to envision what human society will even be like at that evolutionary scale. I suspect it'll be kind of a ridiculous notion to even have a body, right? To even have human intelligence be limited, to the wet work of our, Darwinian biology, right? AIDS, Susie has AIDS. What? If Rob has 5 apples and Sam has 3, what does Susie have? AIDS. Susie has AIDS. That's very funny. Well, I guess it's not. AIDS isn't particularly funny, but cool. You understood my question exactly. Thanks. Yeah, awesome. Yeah, awesome topic, man. Who have killed Catherine? I don't know who you're talking about. I'm a high school dropout. Nice to meet you. Nice to meet you too. By the way, when I say that I have a PhD, I am not implying that I'm any smarter than any of you. I promise. because I'm not. It's been demonstrated to me multiple times. It just so happens that I had the privilege of focusing on this one particular topic for like 10 years. So yeah, get me talking about pretty much anything else and I'm useless to you. You certainly wouldn't accuse me of being smart. Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure what you mean by Catherine. What's your opinion about people who are against Bill Gates? Well, I mean, there's a bunch of different reasons to be against Bill Gates. I mean, people have problems with the ability of some folks to amass that level of wealth, right? That, that it's a problem for society that like somebody can have such a disproportionately greater share of the nation's wealth that, what's the difference between that and a warlord, or a king, so that's a problem that I think is justifiable to have with, notice me senpai, hey, what's up? So that's a problem. But I think, the people that hone in on his, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, in their contributions to research and in biomedical science and in vaccinology, I think that's just totally misplaced. In fact, if he didn't, if like that organization or the Chan Zuckerberg Foundation or all these sort of these philanthropic sort of organizations didn't exist, I think that would be morally reprehensible. That they have billions and billions and billions of dollars, but they don't spend it on things that could improve the lives of millions and millions of people. That would just be completely repulsive. That would, I think the only thing that's keeping them in their positions is that they're doing that. Otherwise, I think that they'd be having some social problems. But anyways, yeah. So, but there's so many conspiracy theories that like Bill Gates wants to put chips in the vaccines, and that I saw another one where he, wants to manipulate mosquitoes to deliver vaccines and stuff like that. And essentially, without exception, they are based on complete misunderstandings. First of all, the chip in the vaccine, that is like complete fabrication, right? Not the least of which being because Bill Gates does not own any company that makes vaccines. He invests in research. You could accuse Pfizer or Moderna, but like, why would they do that? Like, they get no benefit. And also, their vaccine is extremely difficult to make. Not difficult to make, but a precarious formulation, right? It's mRNA and lipid nanoparticles. Okay. So, I have a question about my vision. Oh, I'm sorry. Where are you getting those questions? Oh, are you not seeing these comments? That's interesting. Well, it did kill hundreds of people in Africa. Well, more like thousands. I don't know what you're referring to. Plus, we all have cell phones that already track us. Dude, that's exactly right, dude. Yeah, Scott. I mean, yeah, exactly. Okay, is it true we only use 10% of our brains? So, no, but to you. Yeah, right. No, you do, though. No, so that is a misunderstanding. Oh, cool. I think this is Claudio. That's a misunderstanding. We are not limited to any specific percentage of brain activity, except for the limitation beyond which we would start having seizures. So that's the only limit, but it's not like a hard and fast number. And the percentage of brain activity that's going on in your brain at any one time is fluctuating rapidly, millisecond to millisecond. So it sounds like we're connected. Claudio, in Brazil, what's on your mind?
Hi, Ian. Good evening.
Good evening. How are you doing?
I'm fine, thank you. I have a question about an article I read recently by two neuroscientists, an article on Time magazine. And that was about a theory they developed to explain why we dream. And they called the theory something like defensive activation mechanism, something like that, where we would dream because if we didn't dream, the part of our brain responsible for vision could suffer a takeover from other senses. So because the visual cortex is the only, they claim that the vision is the only sense that is impaired during darkness, that the REM activity would be responsible for, throwing in like phony or made up visions, so that those cells were kept active and did not develop other skills like hearing better or whatever. And I just want to to hear from you about this theory. What do you think about it?
It's very interesting. I mean, my first reaction is, that is certainly defensible. Like, so basically, what's really interesting about the human brain is that different parts of the brain, different sensory systems, can be co-opted, and essentially, like, if there's just insufficient activity in any given region. This is true, by the way, for when somebody is an amputee. Right, the region of the brain that regulates that, the region that is lost can begin to not atrophy really, but it shrinks in volume, right? And so other brain regions sort of like take over that space. When it comes to vision, the visual cortex is a gigantic part of the brain. And, like, for example, I think we've talked in the past about a device called the brain port, where people who are blind but still have an intact visual cortex, basically they have a pair of glasses that has a camera on it, and the camera is attached to this palette that they wear on their tongue. And the palette has a bunch of little electrodes on it that stimulate different parts of the tongue. Tongue's extraordinarily sensitive to touch, right, to sensation. And if they practice for long enough, and keep in mind, totally blind, they practice for long enough, they can use that sensation to navigate as though it were vision. But what's interesting beyond that is that activity in the visual cortex has been detected in these folks, right, wearing this brain port. And, this is fundamentally a tactile sensory experience generating activity in the visual cortex, which would only occur. It's called sensory substitution. So when it comes to, let's say justifying why humans have dreams, that model for me, I have to read the article obviously to understand that, what argument they're really making. But for me, that argument that the reason that we dream is for a specific evolutionary purpose, generally speaking, that's called the there's like a formal name for that fallacy. It's called like the adaptivity fallacy or something like that, where anything you see in the human body or in biology in general, there has to be a purpose for it. There has to be some evolutionary advantage specifically for it. Otherwise, it wouldn't be there. Otherwise, it'd be selected out. And that's just not the correct way to see evolution. There are plenty of aspects of biology that are not optimal for an organism's biology, but nonetheless, they exist. So when it comes to dreaming, right, a similar theory that I've heard that, it would almost fit perfectly into, or that whole like dreaming so that our visual cortex doesn't atrophy, essentially, that whole argument would fit into, it would be compatible with this theory, is essentially what's called free energy. It's this free energy in the physics sense. But basically the argument is that, certain patterns of brain activity while we're dreaming are measured, or can be measured. And there are discrete, or let's say, different types of patterns that can occur during REM sleep. One of them are called PGO waves. It's like pontine geniculate occipital waves, just waves of activity that cycle from pretty much brainstem regions up, through the higher order, cerebrum, basically. And it turns out that you have more of these PGO waves if during the day before you go into sleep, you were exposed to a lot of novelty, right? New experiences. You went skydiving, or you socialized with people you've never met before, blah, 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 these types of things. You went on a date for Valentine's Day or something. And so, one of the arguments is that the reason or the effect of dreaming is that we essentially recycle those experiences, those sensory experiences, those cognitive, those emotional experiences. We just recycle them. And the reason for that, or the advantage to doing that, would be that it prepares us, right? That it rehearses. That used to be sort of how this was explained, where like we dream to rehearse. But really, in this, it's that this novel experience, what we don't want for it to be is novel anymore, because if it happened once, it's probably going to happen again. And so if you rehearse, right, if you move through that kind of activity, it's less likely to be novel because you've experienced it again while you're sleeping. That's one argument. For me, frankly, I find a different argument more compelling. And I should say, that argument sounds quite reminiscent of like, it's serving some kind of like biological purpose. But for me, I think this is why I think we dream. And it's not just my theory, right? the period of our life cycle during which we have the greatest proportion of REM sleep is when we're actually still in the womb. It's before we're actually born. And that brain activity, those patterns of brain activity, therefore, are almost certainly involved in orchestrating the development of the nervous system, right? Because certain neurons need for there to be activity between them to form connections. Without that activity, they wouldn't know that they're there to form connections. And so you're having all this REM activity when you're in the womb, and then you're born. Your brain is still developing, right? I mean, my daughter is generating thousands and thousands of new neurons every second, right? Still at 2 years old. But, so the brain is still developing, and there needs to be some mechanism, and she sleeps, regularly, takes these big fat naps and stuff. And so, so for me, REM's, that is the clear biological role that REM and therefore dreaming plays. But then, okay, so my brain is done developing for the most part. I've been having very, very potent, vivid dreams, over the past few months. I wonder why. So why do you, Claudio, and I have dreams? Well, so there is some mechanism that generates that automatic activity during REM sleep, right? And, so there is an evolutionary advantage to having it happen. But what is the disadvantage of having it no longer happen, right? Or I'm sorry, what is the disadvantage for it continuing to happen, right? If somebody never dreams, would they be more likely to reproduce? No, right? It would have no significant effect. And there's probably all these salutary effects, right? Like strengthening the connections that have been made between neurons, that full free energy concept of, rehearsing it is arguably a benefit. And so for me, it's just dreams are an automatic byproduct of the fact that we, as a part of our evolution, have this system that is necessary to form our brain. And then there's just no reason for it to have gone, right? And so we continue dreaming. And the reason that we have this perceptual experience, or this, this whole sort of comprehensive experience of a dream, it's not just like seeing colors or something like that, is because the same brain regions that are involved in seeing colors, in interacting with other people, and memories, and mood, and all that, those same brain regions are being activated during the dream. And so the brain is going to do what it always does, make sense of that activity in some kind of coherent way, and therefore we dream. So I know that was a long spiel, but that's how I think about dreaming. I don't dislike that argument that it plays some kind of protective role in preventing the sort of incursion by other sensory systems or other cognitive systems. But for me, I think that's part of a broader story of why we dream.
Well, thank you. That's a great explanation and very, very good speculation on things. And if you want to read the article I just referred to, you just Google Time Magazine Why We Dream, and it should come at the top.
Yeah. Okay, I see it. Yeah. Awesome. Oh, it came out. Yeah, not too long ago. Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Claudio. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. Take care. Have a good evening. Have a good night.
You too. A friend in Brazil. All right. I should call it a day. Thank you so much for joining. I have a YouTube channel, youtube.com/anthropoid. Today I talked about whether we can be sure that when you see a red rose, that your experience of that red rose is identical to my experience of that red rose. So you can check that out, youtube.com/anthropoid. I also have been using a new live streaming platform called haps.tv. It's a great new platform, a lot of tools, growing community, great philosophy behind the platform, smart people. The YouTube is youtube.com/anthropoid. You can I have a link in my profile page. You can just, so both of these, so both the YouTube and the haps.tv. So go check out the YouTube, go check out the Haps if you are interested in sustaining these conversations after the next few weeks. Otherwise, happy Valentine's Day if you celebrate that. Otherwise, have a great beginning of your week, and I'll see you next week. See you guys. All right, everybody, thanks so much for hanging out on YouTube. I really appreciate that. As always, love any feedback you might have. If you enjoy this kind of stuff. Oh my gosh, you have so many comments. I didn't see it. Oh geez, I'm so sorry about that. How are you enjoying it? Maybe you already talked about this. Curious, many years ago, heard that it is best for the infant baby cognitive development to use black and white toys, images. Yes, Frank, awesome topic. So quickly, the only reason for that is that infant visual development, infants, like their whole sensorium is completely like meaningless. It's just their sensory systems aren't finished wiring yet. And so there's even arguments that like infants may be experiencing synesthesia, where they're like, seeing sounds and hearing colors and these types of things. That is very difficult to prove, but we know for sure that their visual system, they're barely able to see like this far away from them when they're quite young. And then some of the earliest things that come on board are just contrast, very, very sharp contrast, and there's no sharper contrast than black and white. And so that's really the only reason why. But it does, but you want them to exercise those that capability. Like we did that with my daughter for sure. You want them to exercise that, to become sensitive, to develop literally the connectivity that enables us to distinguish, here's a line, here's a perpendicular, here's an angle, like all those neurons need to come on board. And so that's why and also they can just see them more easily. They can see black and white toys. So that's why. And what would happen if I used my whole brain? Oh, seizures. That doesn't sound fun. Keep having a dream about a certain part of a video game where I'm always worried about dying. Is that my brain running through the scenarios over and over like a training program? Yes. I mean, pretty much. Well, that's what that theory that I brought up would suggest. Yes. Basically that, because you're essentially sculpting your brain by that experience to just continually experience that experience. And so therefore, like, inevitably when the brain rehearses or recapitulates all those patterns, not all of them, but a lot of the patterns of brain activity that you had during the day when you were playing that game, inevitably you're going to experience a lot of the same things. So yeah. Okay. With that, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, if you dug it, hit subscribe. Otherwise, I will see you next week. See you guys.